Fatima walked into the quiet, dimly lit hospital room with her usual calmness, her focus set on another day of work. She had spent years in training, working tirelessly to become the nurse she was. Raised in an orphanage since she could remember, life had been far from easy, but Fatima was accustomed to challenges. She had taken the setbacks and turned them into a quiet, powerful strength. She was driven by a deep desire to care for others, to be the kindness and warmth she had often wished for herself while growing up. That day, her supervisor assigned her to a new patient, an elderly man named Romeo, who had been in a coma for several months. It was whispered among the staff that he was a billionaire, a man with immense wealth and influence. Yet, his fortune seemed insignificant in the sterile white room. Romeo lay still, his face softened by age, his body vulnerable in ways that wealth couldn't protect. For Fatima, it didn't matter whether he was a billionaire or a man without a dollar to his name. A patient was a patient, and her commitment was the same. Days turned into weeks as she attended to his needs. She read to him softly, checked his vitals, changed his bandages, and occasionally told stories aloud, even though she wasn't sure he could hear her. Fatima found comfort in these small acts, connecting with him as she would any patient who might need a gentle presence to guide them through. She believed that every patient, even in a coma, could sense the care and warmth around them. One quiet afternoon, as she adjusted Romerio's pillow, she noticed something unusual, a small birthmark just below his neck, shaped like a crescent moon. Her hand froze midair. It was a birthmark she had seen before, one she had always known on herself. Memories of her childhood flashed through her mind, of the stories she used to create about her birthmark, imagining it connected her to someone out there, a family she had never known. As she took a shaky breath, lost in thought, Romerio's eyelids fluttered. For the first time in months, he began to stir. Fatima quickly leaned closer, calling softly, "Mr. Romeo, can you hear me?" He opened his eyes, blinking slowly as he tried to focus. His gaze settled on Fatima, his expression one of quiet confusion. Then, suddenly, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, and his eyes widened as they filled with tears. "Mira," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Is that you?" Fatima froze, the shock hitting her like a wave. I'm sorry," she stammered. That was my mother's name." How do you know it?" Romerio's eyes filled with more tears. "Your mother's name was Mira?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Fatima nodded, her mind reeling. She died when I was young. I never knew my father." Romeo looked at her with sorrow etched on his face, covering his mouth with his hand. He seemed weighed down by years of regret. "Fatima," he murmured, her name carrying a mix of love and anguish. "Your mother, I was in love with her once. But life took us in different directions. She never told me she was pregnant." His words hung heavy in the air as Fatima struggled to process them. Are you saying you're my father?" she whispered, feeling a mix of shock, confusion, and yearning. Romeo nodded, his face both anguished and hopeful. "I never knew. If only she had told me, I would have been there. I would have found a way." Fatima stood still, every buried emotion rushing to the surface. She looked at him, a stranger she had cared for as a nurse, but who now stood before her as something entirely different. Her heart ached with the weight of missed years and the questions she had carried since childhood. For so long, she had only had memories of her mother and endless unanswered questions. Now, here he was, her father, the man she had wondered about, the missing piece of a life she had longed to understand. Romeo reached out to her, his hand trembling. She stepped forward, allowing herself to be drawn into his embrace. He held her tightly, his frail arms filled with a fierce determination. "I'm alive because of you, Fatima," he murmured. "You've given me a reason to live, a chance to make up for the years I lost. Please, let me be there for you, as I should have been." Wiping away her tears, Fatima asked. "Do you have any photos of my mother?" "I barely remember her face." Romario's expression softened as he nodded. "Yes. Please hand me my phone. It's in my belongings." With trembling hands, he unlocked his phone and began to scroll through his gallery. Picture after picture filled the screen. Photos of her mother in her youth, her smile vibrant and full of life. Fatima's heart pounded as she looked at each one, piecing together parts of herself that had been lost for so long. The face she remembered only in hazy memories was now alive and clear, captured in moments that showed her mother's kindness, laughter, and strength. Tears slid down Fatima's cheek as she finally believed it. This man was her father. They embraced once more, and she whispered, "I always dreamed of having a father. I wish you had been there. But I'm glad you're here now." Romario, his own tears falling, whispered back, "From today onward, you will never be alone. You are my family, Fatima, my daughter. You mean more to me than anything." From that day on, Romario's recovery seemed to accelerate, as if their newfound connection gave him a renewed will to live. Fatima's visits became less about her duties as a nurse and more about the bond they were forming. Soon, Romario was well enough to leave the hospital.